All right, folks. Well, the second hand just passed 12 o'clock noon, so if there are no objections, well, go ahead and get started. I'd like to start off by wishing everyone now a good afternoon. Thank you for visiting the Museum of the Confederacy, American Civil War Museum, Richmond, and welcome to We Did It in Perfect Line, the story of the 57th Massachusetts from the Wilderness to Fort Stedman. I'd like to start with one kind of quick note of housekeeping. This is the 57th. The 54th is the African American unit in the unit Glory. I will not be quoting Morgan Freeman today. I'm sorry if that disappoints anyone. Now, I'd like to begin our story on the evening of May 5th, 1864, with Colonel William Francis Bartlett, the man on the left there. Bartlett, writing in his personal journal, is voicing a bit of apprehension. "My regiment is in no condition to take into action, but I must do the best that I can," he wrote. His doubts are not in the men themselves, but more through their lack of training, lack of drill. They had been raised in a New England winter, and if there's one thing we all should know from recent experience, it's that New England winters can be a little harsh. They had not had much time for drill, they had not had much time for parade, and Bartlett said, "Give me 20 days and I can make a splendid regiment of this." But man proposes and Grant disposes. Ulysses S. Grant, now commander-in-chief of all Union armies, had attached his headquarters to the Army of the Potomac, still under the command of George Gordon Meade. Grant ordered that Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia would now be Meade's target. Wherever Lee goes, you will go also. And on May 5th, 1864, the two armies met in a tangle of trees and brush known locally as the Wilderness. May 6th would see more troops committed to the fray, and among them would be Colonel Bartlett's 57th Massachusetts Veteran Volunteers. "It will be a bloody day," Bartlett wrote. He predicted well. To meet the demands of an all-consuming war, now about to enter its fourth year, Abraham Lincoln had issued a call for 300,000 volunteers in October of 1863. Over the preceding summer, Governor John A. Andrew of Massachusetts, the man on the right here, had anticipated such a call-up. Now, the year before, in 1862, Andrew had authorized the raising of several 9-month regiments. And in September, October of 1863, their terms of service would be expiring. So now, Andrew was looking for a way to entice those men to re-enlist for a 3-year term of enlistment or the duration of the war. And so, to attract veterans, he creates a special title, if you will, and authorizes raising 4 so-called veteran regiments: the 56th, the 57th, the 58th, and the 59th. To further entice recruits, there is the offer of a $300 federal bounty and a $325 state bounty. Now, the 57th Massachusetts would be primarily recruited from the area of Worcester, Massachusetts, and its surroundings. Recruitment was slow. The barracks of Camp Wool in Massachusetts filled in fits and starts. It was only on March 17th that the regiment had enough men present to hold its first formal dress parade. And where Company A was the first to muster into U.S. service on January 4th, 1864, Company K would be the last, mustered in April 6th. So that's some 4 months later. Within a few weeks of Company K being mustered in, the 57th is on its way to Washington. Arriving in camp at Annapolis, Maryland on April 20th, they were assigned to Carruth's Brigade of Stevenson's 1st Division of the 9th Army Corps, commanded by Ambrose Burnside. The man known for his infamous sideburns on the left, the badge of the 9th Corps there on the right. Marching south on April 29th, Horace Clark Jr., a 35-year-old fifer in the ranks of Company H, dropped dead from heat stroke. He would be the regiment's first fatality in the field and far from its last. Dozens more by this point were also absent from the ranks, their names either added to the sick list or many others deserting at the earliest opportunity. $625 is a lot of money, and the 57th is not the only regiment offering such bounties. Many men are what we call bounty jumpers. They enlist, they get paid, they desert, they join somebody else, they get paid there. If they don't get caught, it's a chance to make a fortune. Now, on the eve of their first battle, that week in May of 1864, the 57th would muster 548 effectives, meaning men who can shoulder a musket. 916 had left Massachusetts. As I said, the Battle of the Wilderness started on May 5th. On May 6th, it resumes, with Grant and Meade ordering Burnside's 9th Corps into a heavily forested gap between the Federal 5th and 2nd Corps. As they moved forward, Company K was detailed to guard the 9th Corps baggage trains. A bit of a reprieve, if you will, pulled out of the line and sent to the rear. They would miss this battle. Well, most of them, 15 men who'd fallen out of the line of march, kind of show up at the last minute and get thrown into line anyway. But as Carruth's brigade moved forward from reserve, it deployed into 4 lines. In the first line were the 4th and 10th U.S. Regulars, followed by the 56th Massachusetts, then the 59th Massachusetts, and bringing up the rear, the 57th. Despite their veteran status, only some 20% of the men in the ranks were actually veterans. Many of these men are seeing action for the first time in the war. When a regiment in front of them refused to go forward, General Winfield Scott Hancock, commander of 2nd Corps, personally ordered them to step over this regiment and go forward themselves. Colonel Bartlett watched his men step off and remarked later, "We did it in perfect line." Hancock, remembering the 57th's advance, summed it up in one word: glorious. Writing the regiment's post-war history, Captain John Anderson remarked, "It is a well-known fact that men under fire for the first time, as many of the 57th were, expose themselves more than necessary. Not yet acquainted with the song of the Minnie-Ball, they will stand up straight and face their fate like men." Company H burst from the brush not 10 feet from makeshift fortifications manned by A.P. Hill's veteran Confederates. Anderson would call this a veritable baptism of fire by total immersion. In his modern history of the regiment, Warren Wilkinson calculates the 57th lost 1 man every 15 seconds. Veteran Captain Joseph Gerd had just finished instructing his Company B how to behave under fire when a Minnie-Ball struck him in the head, killing him instantly. Sergeant Charles Knox of Company C, by many accounts, was hit dead square between the eyes. George and William Maynard of Sterling, Massachusetts, both died with the 57th Massachusetts this day. 3 weeks earlier, their brother Charles with the 34th Massachusetts had died of disease. Standing 5 feet 5 inches tall, Hungarian by birth, and possibly the only Jewish man in the regiment, 23-year-old Color Sergeant Leopold Karpelis jumped on top of a tree stump and began to wave the colors to rally the troops. Brigadier General Wadsworth, 4th Division, 5th Corps, appeared next to him and began imploring every man who could see the colors to rally to them. General Wadsworth would later be mortally wounded that day. Meanwhile, taking a swig of water from the canteen of Company I Sergeant Edwin McFarland, Colonel Bartlett was hit in the head by a glancing blow. This is the 3rd time Bartlett would be wounded in action in the war. As a captain of the 20th Massachusetts, he had lost a leg outside of Yorktown. As colonel of the 49th Massachusetts, he'd been severely wounded in the arm at Port Hudson. And now, the head an inconsequential matter, he fell from his horse, crushed his artificial leg, and badly mangled his stump. He had to be carried to the rear. As Bartlett fell wounded, events outside the field of view were taking shape. 1st Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, James Longstreet, hit Hancock's 2nd Corps in the flank. Now, 2nd Corps is quite possibly the best in the Army of the Potomac. They had won distinction, fame, valor, and bled on many of the most severest fields of the war. Many of these men are nearing the end of their 3-year enlistments. They're this close to going home, they don't want to die here. Many others are just plain exhausted, to use the term of the time, played out, and they collapse. As Hancock said, the flank would roll up like a wet blanket. Now this confusion reaches the area where the 57th is now engaged in the fighting, and men broke for the rear. As he retreated, and now in command of the regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Chandler saw Sergeant Carpella struggling with the colors that were tangled in some brush. "Boys, don't forsake your colors," he cried, and 37 men rallied to his call. Lying quietly in the vegetation, these men, trapped until nightfall, escaped capture by the skin of their teeth. At one point, a Confederate burst into their hiding place and found himself staring down the muzzle of Colonel Chandler's pistol. And Chandler informed him he was now a prisoner of war. The man threw away his musket and laid down with them and came back in with them later that evening. The rest of the regiment rallied along the Brock Road where Federal troops established a final defensive line. For his own part in the battle, Leopold Carpellis would be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor on April 30th, 1870. But in their first battle, in killed, wounded, captured, and missing, the 57th Massachusetts lost 262 men, nearly a 48% loss. And these are the casualty figures from the Wilderness. When Company K returned from guard duty a couple days later, they were double the size of the other companies in the regiment. Now, having been checked in the Wilderness, Grant set his sights on Spotsylvania Courthouse, where he hoped to force himself between Lee's command and Richmond. Lee's men won the foot race, and a battle was underway. 9th Corps fell into line to the left of 2nd Corps, across from the eastern side of the Confederate fortifications. Forming a giant arc, the Confederate position became known as the Mule Shoe. On the evening of May 10th, Colonel Emory Upton led an assault that met with some success, and Grant decided 2nd Corps would make a larger assault supported by the entire Army, with 5th and 6th Corps attacking the enemy left and 9th Corps attacking the enemy right. This is a map of where the 57th would be fighting. May 12th, 1864, 2nd Corps kicks off an attack at 4:30 in the morning. As the sky began to lighten, 9th Corps went in on their own front. Facing fierce musketry and artillery fire, they could not breach the Confederate works. At 9 o'clock, Confederate forces counterattacked, and while they checked the advance, they could not force the Federals to relinquish the ground they had taken. The 57th was in action all morning. They were with Weld's brigade, which you can kind of see in the back there, supporting artillery. Ordered now, as they went in again, 9th Corps in another attack, they were in shouting distance of the Confederate positions. The 57th was ordered to lay down in the mud. And as they lay there, they could hear Confederate officers shouting orders to their men to organize them for an attack. Waiting till the moment where he could anticipate the next order being forward march, Lieutenant Colonel Chandler rose from the mud and ordered the 57th Massachusetts to charge. Rising out of the ground in a rush, the men caught the Confederates off guard and routed them back. Victims of their own success in the advance, they're left with their flanks exposed, unsupported, and were ordered to lie down again, hugging dear, sweet Mother Earth as Confederate artillery came shrieking in. Union artillery replied, and now the 57th found itself under the umbrella of an artillery duel. Massachusetts soldiers buried themselves in the ground every time a shell exploded nearby. Some buried themselves in the mud and failed to explode at all. Unlucky soldiers nearby, frozen in fear, refusing to move until ordered lest the slightest tremor convinced the reluctant shell to blow up. This lot of Confederate powder was poor, wrote Anderson after the war, and showed that dishonest contractors were not all on our side. In front of Company G's lines, soaking in a torrential rain, a wounded Confederate lay immobile with a shattered thigh. Captain Doherty, a possible native of Ireland, looked to his men and said, "Who will go rescue that man?" Not a man volunteered. Well, "I never ask a man to do what I would not do myself," Doherty said, and personally ran out and carried the wounded Confederate to safety. I wish the story had a happier ending. The Confederate dies a few days later in a federal hospital, but Doherty comes through it unscratched. Of 333 men engaged that day, the 57th Massachusetts loses 78 total. Mud, rain, and sharpshooter fire marked the remainder of the week. The weather, torrential rains, finally cleared on May 17th, and another assault commenced on the 18th. In this fight, the 57th would be engaged again, losing another 18 men. When it became clear that he would accomplish nothing else at Spotsylvania, Grant moved around Lee's flank and kept marching ever southward. Writing after the war, John Anderson said, "There seemed to be a great fondness among old Virginians for naming their towns and rivers in the feminine gender. Only 3 weeks had elapsed since we crossed the Rapid Ann. Now we were again rivals for the smiles and favors of her twin sister, North Anna, who was as cold as her name might imply. Lee had his army in a prime position, dug in along high ground. One would either have to be stupid or drunk to attack here. Enter General James Hewitt Ledlie." It was about noon on May 24th when the 237 effectives of the 57th Massachusetts splashed across the North Anna at Quarles Mill. Private George Robinson of Company H tangled his feet in a lost gun belt in the river. The belt contained a revolver and bayonet. Presenting these to the colonel, Chandler decided to keep the revolver and then began jokingly trying to offer the bayonet to troops as they passed by. General James Hewitt Ledlie, the man you see here, had recently taken charge of the brigade. General Stevenson, recently been killed at Spotsylvania. Now, Ledlie earned his rank not through any innate command ability on his part, but more through political connections. He is eager to make a name for himself. On looking up the hill at Confederate positions, he spies what seems to be an isolated battery. Now, he looks for the nearest officer, which happens to be Lieutenant John Anderson, the same man who wrote the post-war history, and sends him back to find General Crittenden, commanding the division. Anderson puzzled over this in later years. The bearer of the message, he doesn't mention himself by name, was not a staff officer, was wholly unknown to General Crittenden, and knew not where to find him. Though as luck would have it, he went right to him. Crittenden said, "Do not attack," and later amended it to say, "unless Ledlie spies a sure thing." But as he returned with Crittenden's orders, he found that Ledlie had already arranged the brigade for an attack. Somewhere between asking forgiveness and asking permission, he was just going to do it anyway. Now, on his way back, Anderson could actually see the Confederate works and had determined that that battery was not as isolated as it first appeared. But Ledlie's mind was set, well fortified with Dutch courage. Apparently, the rest of the staff had also imbibed a little bit. One of Ledlie's staff officers was plugging away at the rebels with a small caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. The approximate range the staff officer is trying to shoot at is about 800 yards. My joke is the effective range of a pistol at this time is about as far as you can throw it. It has never been learned what damage he did, Anderson said. At all events, the battery did not surrender. Federal troops moved forward with their tipsy general in the lead. The line broke apart almost immediately, men just breaking forward in a mad rush under a darkening sky. Confident in their position, Confederates stood atop their works, waving, "Come on, Yanks, come on to Richmond." Color Sergeant Carpellis went down in the first fires, but refused to move to the rear. Picking up the colors, he carried them on, only abandoning his post when loss of blood weakened him and his body demanded it. Case and canister swept the ranks as cannon added to the din. At 6:45, the skies opened in torrents of rain, swept by lightning and thunder. On the flanks of the 1st Brigade, Confederate troops appeared. Squeezed in the vice of a counterattack, the Federals had no choice but to retreat. Colonel Chandler turned to Colonel Weld of the 56th Massachusetts and told him, "I'm going to rally my men and try to make a stand. Weld said, "I will join you." And gathering about 50 men apiece, they were torn apart again by a volley from William Mahone's Confederates, who had somehow maneuvered unseen to within 40 yards. Chandler fell, mortally wounded. Captain Albert Prescott and Sergeant McFarland, along with others, tried to carry him from the field. Recognizing his condition as fatal, Chandler told them, "You can do nothing for me. Save yourselves if you can." Doing what they could for his comfort, as soon as he seemed comfortable, they ran for their lives. Chandler died 2 hours later. Under flag of truce, Brigadier General Nathaniel H. Harris returned the colonel's effects under flag of truce to be mailed home. In addition to their noble lieutenant colonel, 38 other men failed to answer roll call that evening. Another slip around Lee's flank. More marching, more maneuvering. And the Army of the Potomac was within reach of Richmond, Virginia, at Cold Harbor. Now I'm assuming that with an interest in the Civil War, we've probably encountered descriptions of the bloody frontal assaults at Cold Harbor, thousands of men dying in a matter of minutes. Ninth Corps is not a part of that. Ninth Corps, in fact, actually has some success. They're out on the right flank. So you see the units of 57th will be a part of up at the extreme top of the map there. A couple incidents in this battle, though, are worth repeating. Detailed for much of June 3rd, the day of the Battle of Cold Harbor, the 57th Massachusetts was supporting the 11th Massachusetts Artillery, and gunners on both sides were throwing shells back and forth. One man, or as Anderson calls him, a reckless young fellow, planted himself upon a tree stump, curious to watch the exchange. Laughing off his comrades' exhortations for him to take cover, the man boasted, "The shot has not yet been made that could hit me." You know where this is going. At that moment, a shell did not strike him, but hit the tree stump, throwing him upon the ground with such force he swore he had been hit. I can only assume that Anderson does not mention this young man by name in the post-war history. It's more of a "you know who you are" kind of thing. Another man in Company G suffered a minor wound and began to limp for the rear. A comrade started after him to help him along. But the wound was not that serious. The man could manage on his own. And Captain Doherty confronted the would-be helper, accusing him of shirking. Marching the man to the front of the Federal works, Doherty climbed up there with them, and with both of them standing in full view of the Confederates, Doherty drilled the man in the manual of arms. Bullets whizzed by them, but miraculously, neither man was wounded, although Doherty counted 3 holes in his coat when they got back. After the bloodbath of Cold Harbor, Grant gave up moving on Richmond and instead turned his focus on Petersburg. With several converging rail lines, most of Lee's supplies moved through the cockade city, and Grant aimed to take it. Stealing a march on Lee, the Army of the Potomac crossed south of the James River and began to advance on the city. Several attacks were made, and on June 17, 1864, the 57th Massachusetts would make their own. I apologize, this map is not the actual event I'm about to describe, but it's close enough you can get an idea of the ground. Rejoining the regiment for duty from the ambulance trains, June 13th, Lieutenant George Barton's first battle with the 57th was almost his last. You had the Confederate works, you had a cornfield, and a sort of depression where the 57th was taking cover. And the Confederate gunners, with a small charge of powder and some solid shot, just a solid round cannonball, could bounce these shells across the open field into the Federals. And they got pretty good at looking and telling where these shells were going to go and telling people to dodge. Barton had a near miss. The shell tore off the sleeve of his coat and struck Edwin McFarland's musket. Sergeant McFarland, kind of a recurring character here. The musket goes cartwheeling off, and McFarland was pretty upset about it. He'd been carrying that musket throughout the war by this point, and it just rubbed him the wrong way. Now, with the resignation of General Crittenden as division commander, drunken General Ledlie found himself in command of the entire 1st Division of 9th Corps. Absent, presumably drunk, Division command devolved upon Colonel Gould, with Colonel Weld, again of the 56th Massachusetts, in command of 1st Brigade. Weld had a bit of advice for his men. When you get the order to charge, you leg it like the devil. Don't stop for anything, just run as tight as you can. Private Edward M. Schneider of Company K had previously been wounded at North Anna. While painful, his wound was not serious enough to actually list him with the casualties, but he had gone to the rear. When he returned to his regiment, he got a bit of ribbing for trying to shirk. Schneider, son of American missionaries and born in Turkey, told his comrades, "I intend to be the first one to enter their works." At the stage set, the attack began. When they got the order to charge, they legged it like the devil. Swept by artillery and musketry, men fell, but they crested the first line of rebel works. Confederates fled to a second line, and it all started all over again. Captain Doherty was wounded in the hand by canister, which severely mangled it. Waving his mangled hand around, he shouted, "Now see what the damned rebels have done." When he was told to go to the rear, he roared, "Do you think I'm going to desert the boys now? No, sir. Not until we get that battery." Kept his promise. As gunners were reloading, men from the 57th swept the guns and captured them. Colonel Weld, the brigade commander, frantically sent runners to the rear for more ammunition. His pleas went unanswered. In the end, his men settled for the first line of trenches they captured. After the fighting, Weld found Ledley passed out drunk in the rear. 57th Massachusetts lost 52 men that day. Among them was Sergeant John Cooley of Company A. A native of County Galway and veteran of the all-Irish 28th Massachusetts, his men discovered his body in the cornfield the next day. His friends dug for him a shallow grave and laid him to rest. A few days before, he had interred fallen comrades after the Battle of Cold Harbor, saying, "I wonder who will do this for me." Anderson remembered him as a good soldier, a gallant man, and a genial comrade. Seeking to remove whatever stains might have been upon his honor, Edward Schneider dashed to the fore. He was the first man of the 57th Massachusetts to stand upon the rebel works, and in an instant, he fell, shot in both arms, the right hand, the left leg, and through the stomach. Found next morning, he was carried to a hospital where his abdominal wound was announced to be fatal. In a letter to Schneider's sister, the regiment's chaplain, Reverend Dashiell, described his last moments. When told that he had a few hours to live, he looked up at me with a smile and repeated the verse of the song which is sung by the soldiers, "Who will care for mother now?" changing the key word to sister. His last words were a message to his comrades: stand by the dear old flag and cling to the cross of Christ. He died just before dawn, June 19th. When Dashiell learned of his death, he stood and wept and refused to bury the boy in a common grave. He buried him next to a tree near a nearby public road, nailed an identifying marker to it. Edward M. Schneider was 17 years old. Now, Grant had stolen a march on Lee, but Lee did not stay fooled for long. Even as the 57th attacks on June 17th, reinforcements from the Army of Northern Virginia are already pouring south of the James, and both sides dig in for a siege. Earth thick enough to absorb shot and deflect shell, pired high enough to shelter a man, becomes the rule of the day. In front of them, moats, abattis, chevaux de frise, branches, trees, trunks, sharpened to deter attack, backed by rifle pits which shelter pickets who will warn of anyone bold enough to try. Under sweltering June and July heat, men suffered and died, enduring constant threat of death by sharpshooter's bullet and mortar shell. On July 19th, the men of Company K, who had been raised as the Sharpshooter Company, received 3 dozen Spencer repeating rifles. They had been promised these from the start. They only now arrive. "I've tried our rifles this forenoon and found them first rate," wrote Francis Harrington, and on July 21st, Lieutenant Cook, now in command of the company, led the men on a little skirmish with rebel pickets. Now, the Spencer rifle, fed by a tubular magazine in the rear, can fire 7 shots before reloading. So these men are now packing some serious firepower. Regrettably, it leads them to overconfidence. Lieutenant Cook stepped out completely from cover to take a shot at one rebel picket, and the Confederate beat him to the punch. His men carried him back to the trenches. He lingered near death for several days and eventually succumbed to complications of his wounds in 1893. He lives the war. Though drunken General Ledlie remains in command of the division, William Francis Bartlett returned to command 1st Brigade, giving the men some confidence in at least part of their leadership. And as July wore on, a plan to break the stalemate of trench life was taking shape beneath the men's feet. Colonel Henry Pleasance, with the miners of his 48th Pennsylvania Regiment, had gone to work underground. They dug a 510-foot-long shaft to reach the Confederate position at Elliott's Salient, dug a gallery, packed it with 8,000 pounds of gunpowder, and set to blow the Confederates sky high. Training for this duty were the United States Colored Troops of the 4th Division of the 9th Corps. They were the freshest of the lot. For much of Grant's Overland Campaign, they had been in the rear, guarding baggage trains and other such details. Their regiments were still full. Their men were still enthusiastic. At the last minute, however, Meade and Grant objected. Should the assault fail and the result be a massacre, the appearances of having used the USCTs as cannon fodder would be a political nightmare. Burnside called his division commanders together, and when none of them volunteered their shattered divisions for the forlorn hope, he had them draw straws. So it turned to General Ledlie to lead the attack. Meade's orders to Burnside were clear. Trip the mine, move forward, seize the crest of Cemetery Hill behind the Confederate positions. Burnside's orders to Ledlie were clear. Once the mine is tripped, move through the Confederate positions and seize the crest of Cemetery Hill. Ledlie's orders to his brigade commanders were clear. Move into the Confederate entrenchments to the right and left of the crater, fortify them, and somebody else is going to take Cemetery Hill. At 4:42 a.m. on the morning of July 30th, as the dawn light started to outline the horizon, a low rumble lifted the earth beneath sleeping Confederates, lifting bodies, caissons, and cannons, and clumps of clay 60 or 70 feet in the air. The noise of the explosion itself was drowned out as 144 pieces of Federal artillery thundered to life, pounding stunned Confederate positions. The 57th Massachusetts with 1st Brigade were the second wave to leave Federal trenches, and when they reached the crater, men just simply stopped to behold the carnage. Never seen anything like it. Men just degenerated into a confused mob. Bartlett, confusing his orders as to which left or right he was supposed to move to, ends up intermixed with the 2nd Brigade. And it's not like he's getting any clarification from his commander because guess where General Ledlie is? In the rear, drinking, with the commander of 4th Division. Trying to rally in the face of increased Confederate resistance, Major Prescott, now commanding the 57th, fell dead. Succeeding him in command, Captain Dresser was killed a moment later. Lieutenants Barton and Anderson were wounded. Lieutenant Reed was captured. The command of the entire regiment devolved upon Lieutenant Doty, still fairly new to his commission. Eventually, the entire 9th Corps, some 15,000 men, ends up crowded in the area in the crater. Colonel Weld summarized this as altogether the most miserable and meanest experience I ever had in my life. You could not fight, you could not give an order, you could not get anything done. The 4th Division, the black troops, were also committed to the fray, and when counterattacking Confederates saw them, they were incensed. Colonel Weld was captured that day and personally witnessed 2 black prisoners get summarily executed by Confederates. Now at this point, it becomes something of every man for himself. Confederate artillery is sweeping the rear. William Francis Bartlett had a shell throw up a piece of clay that crushed his cork leg. He's now immobile. He stays to surrender and tells the other men to get away if they can. The 57th Massachusetts went into battle that day with 7 officers and 91 enlisted men. When all was said and done, Lieutenant Doty, The lone officer remaining commanded a regiment of 46. What's more, it also suffered the disgrace of losing their colors when the color guard was overwhelmed and forced to surrender. It was as dark a day as any in the regiment's history. If there was a silver lining at all to any of this mess, it was finally enough to remove General Ledlie from command. Now things once more settled into the murderous routine of trench life, broken by the occasional battle. Ordered to support Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps, men of the 9th Corps saw action in the Battle of Weldon Railroad on August 19th. Brigadier General Julius White, now commanding the division, led from the front, a man Ledlie could never be. His presence assured the men, who held off repeated assaults from the Confederates with volleys of lead. At one point, the 57th Massachusetts found itself posted in an exposed and under-supported position. A determined enemy attack drove the regiment back before they could get the line established, all except for Sergeant Edward F. Potter of Company K. Posted as the left guide, he now stood defiantly on his own. General White rode up. "What in hell is that damned fool doing out there? Who in hell is he?" Lieutenant Doty replied, "That, sir, is my left general guide, posted by your order, which he obeys." The general said, "Doesn't the darned fool know enough to come in? That man always obeys orders and will stand there either until shot or relieved by proper authority." "Oh, relieve him mighty quick," the general said, riding off. The next day, Sergeant Potter was called to General White's tent. Reporting as ordered, the general stood up, ripped the sergeant's chevrons from Potter's sleeve, and handed in the shoulder officer. 15 men fell as casualties in the Battle of the Weldon Railroad. At this point, companies B and D essentially ceased to exist. The entire regiment now mustered 30 men. In May, when they entered their first battle, the 57th mustered 528. Let's think about this for a moment. It is 3 months later, and they now muster 1 officer and 29 enlisted men. This, numbers-wise, is the nadir of the regiment's existence. That is a list of those 30 men. You can fit an entire regiment onto a PowerPoint slide. Now, it wouldn't last too long. Men recovering from sickness, recovering from wounds, would return as September turned to October. The 57th Massachusetts mustered some 90 effectives in its first and second battles of Poplar Grove. Still more returned that winter, and by March of 1865, the regiment numbered in the hundreds again. In March of 1865, they still had one more battle to fight. Fort Stedman stood a scant 150 yards from Confederate lines, and it was here that Confederate General John Gordon thought he could win a breakthrough. Led by a picked force of sappers and sharpshooters, and backed by his division and some cavalry, Gordon thought a savage enough attack might rip open the Federal lines and allow them to raid Federal supply dumps, effectively partially crippling or immobilizing the Army of the Potomac. By March 24th, he felt strong enough to make the attack. Just behind Fort Stedman, as you can see on the map here, is the camp of the 57th Massachusetts. In the early morning darkness of March 25th, Lieutenant Henry Jocelyn of the 29th Massachusetts heard men approaching his picket line in the darkness. They announced themselves as deserters, and over the winter of 1864-65, in an attempt to destabilize Lee's army, they had offered some incentives for Confederates to desert and bring their weapons. Only this is the largest group of armed deserters that the lieutenant has ever seen. So he sends a runner back for instructions, and before they can call the trick, Confederate soldiers overwhelmed him. The lieutenant, though, does manage to make an escape. Now, they swept into the fort itself and into the trenches around the fort, and between Fort Stedman and Battery Number 10, were the men of the 57th Massachusetts, currently stationed in the trenches. Many of the men were also in camp. 2 members of the 57th escaped, running through the trenches to their right, spreading warning of the attack to the 2nd Michigan. General Napoleon Bonaparte McLaughlin, now commanding the brigade, did not get any such warning. Commanding 3rd Brigade of 1st Division, a reorganization now means the 57th is not 1st, but 3rd Brigade. McLaughlin rides right into the fort, demanding to know what the commotion is. His answer was to be informed he was now a prisoner of war. Sergeant George Adams of Company G was first to spread word into the camp that an attack was underway. After returning in September and no longer a captain, Major Doherty had command of the regiment. Deploying companies G and K as skirmishers, he led them forward. Finding Confederates swarming everywhere, and without support on either flank, the regiment is forced to fall back through their own camp. As they fell back, Major Doherty turned to Sergeant Major Charles H. Pinkham. "Sergeant Major, where in hell are the colors?" Pinkham replied that the color sergeant being on furlough, the colors were in his tent. Doherty ordered him to go back to camp and get them. In obedience to orders, the sergeant major returned to a camp now overrun with rebels looking for loot. Many years later, Pinkham recalled that, "Under cover of darkness, I gained the tent, seized the colors, and you may be sure I did not wait to hold conversation, but for the time being was a professional sprinter." He reached the regiment unscathed and turned the colors over to Sergeant Chase of Company H. Outnumbered, the 57th Massachusetts was forced to fall back 3 times before a 4th and final defensive line, supported by artillery, they held and checked the Confederate advance. At this point, General John Hartranft, that ain't a Pennsylvania Dutch name, I don't know what is, brought up his divisions of newly recruited, near full-strength Pennsylvania units. With this surge of reinforcements, the day turned against the Confederates. Union troops were now attacking Fort Stedman from 3 sides, and Federal artillery positioned itself to rake the approaches to the fort, making the choice of fight or flight perilous either way. The remnants of the 57th Massachusetts positioned themselves as part of the skirmish line for the division, and as such were some of the first back into the fort. When the Confederate color bearer of the 57th North Carolina was shot down dead, Sergeant Major Pinkham drove for the rebel flag, capturing the regiment's first and only trophy of colors. Pinkham would be promoted to 2nd lieutenant and receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions. Carpellis and Pinkham, the 2 men of the 57th who do win the Medal of Honor. By 8 o'clock that morning, John Gordon's forces could see the writing on the wall. Some ran the gauntlet of fire back to Confederate lines. 1,949 chose to surrender. The day was won, but at frightful cost. First Lieutenant Albert Murdoch, wounded before in the Wilderness, was holding the 57th's colors aloft when he was mortally wounded. His blood soaked into the folds of the flag as he died. Color Corporal Frederick S. Cheney of Company C was one of only 11 men who'd fought in every single battle of the 57th Massachusetts. Never once wounded in all that time, his luck ran out, and in the final battle of the regiment, he was listed killed in action. Major Doherty, the brave Doherty, as they called him, led from the front in his usual style that day. While calling his men to follow him, he too was mortally wounded. When Reverend Dashiell came upon him in the hospital, he offered him salvation through Christ. Doherty replied he could not insult the Savior by offering him the dregs of my life. And with his final words, "God bless you, chaplain," he closed his eyes and passed away. Before the Confederate attack struck, the 57th Massachusetts could count 212 effectives. On the morning of March 26th, they could muster 119. Fortunately, if you choose to see it this way, more than half of their 93 casualties were those that had been swept up as prisoners of war. Most of these men would be paroled and exchanged by April 2nd. It was that same day that Confederate forces and the Confederate government were forced to abandon Richmond and Petersburg. A week later, on April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. In a hospital in Alexandria, Virginia, also on April 9th, 19-year-old Corporal Henry H. Perry died of his wounds. He would be the last to officially die during the war from the 57th. After the war, Lieutenant Colonel William F. Fox scoured records and reports to compile his famous regimental losses of the American Civil War 1861 to 1865. Out of an initial total enrollment of 1,052 men, the 57th Massachusetts, by his count, had lost 201 killed, a loss rate of 19.1%. Thus, when considering the totals killed and wounded as a percentage of maximum enrollment, the 57th Massachusetts ranks third of all federal regiments in the entire war, behind the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery and the 2nd Wisconsin. Though it should be noted, the 2nd Wisconsin fought for 3 years. 57th Massachusetts, less than 1. The 57th would march in the final grand review of the Army of the Potomac on May 23rd, before spending a few restless months in camp near Tinhaleytown, Virginia. That, by the way, is the 11 men who fought in every battle of the regiment. On July 30th, 1865, they were finally mustered out of United States service. Returning to Massachusetts, they drew final pay on August 9th, 1865. 1 year, 2 months, and 21 days after the regiment had left Camp Wool, the 57th Massachusetts Veteran Volunteers formally disbanded. Looking back on their noble, proud service in the War of the Rebellion, many a veteran could say, with head held high, "We did it in perfect line." And that concludes my prepared remarks. Are there any questions? Mm-hmm.
I have 2 questions. One is, was Company K in charge of the horses during the Battle of Wilderness because they were sharpshooters?
I think it was more a random thing. Company K, for some reason, they kind of see fewer deserters, fewer sicknesses than it seems other regiments. So I think they just kind of got picked out at line. I mean, this is literally as they're marching forward towards the battle, it's just, hey, we need some more guys. Can you spare a company? And since you mentioning Company K, quick trivia bit. Company K was, when they organized themselves, they tried to keep all of the immigrants out. The 57th Massachusetts was about 20% Irish, 11% Canadian. Company K was 93% native-born U.S. citizens. And I kid you not, the name at the top of the alphabet on their roster is John Adams. Is it your other question?
Yeah, my second function rate of artillery
And
that people coming after the battle would be blown up anything?
Well, well, we just had, what was it, a decade ago, a collector, while trying to deactivate a shell, blew himself up in his driveway. I mean, the shells today, they're unexploded, they're still active, they're still potentially dangerous. Spotsylvania, though, is a case that it was raining for almost this entire fight, so the ground is very muddy. If you have a percussion shell, it might just bury itself in the mud and nothing ever actually trips the percussion. Or, the mud itself might snuff the fuse and the shell never goes off. But, yes, and I think the just staying still was more paranoia on their own parts than anything else. But you do still have unexploded ordnance. Somebody told me a story. Confederates had percussion fuses where they would take a glass vial, they'd fill it with, I want to say sulfuric acid, some kind of chemical, and they coated it in sugar. And when it broke, the acid would react with the sugar and it would spark. It's a really nice shell that's going to blow up and when it hits something. Apparently a bunch of these were fired into the swamps around Savannah. Again, muddy ground, they don't always go off. Some guy found one. And I'm getting the story second, third hand, but it was from some reenactors who say that this guy approaches them at an event and says, "I got something, can you guys come out and help me ID it?" And it had been rolling around in his truck for a week, and it was one of those shells. And so they all started backing away very slowly, called the local army base. They sent out an EOD team. They're like flipping through their ye big book of ordnance, and they found it where it was classified too dangerous to move, and had to detonate it in the guy's truck. So yeah.
Can you go through one of the battles again and just kind of identify each bar on one of your graphics?
Okay, we'll go back to the last one. So I don't know if it's the green bar is the men engaged as they go into the combat, and from left to right you have killed in action, mortally wounded in action, wounded in action, so that's not fatal, missing in action, prisoner of war, men who are both wounded and then taken prisoner, the total loss, and the blue line is the men remaining at the end of the battle. Well, thank you all very much for coming through today. We have one quick housekeeping note, if you will.